Good morning. I'm Bonnie Gardner. I'm co-chair of the Public Affairs Forum of the First Unitarian Universalist Church of Austin. Welcome. Our forums are most Sundays at noon, and they're free and open to the public, and we encourage you to attend. And today, one of our forum committee members, Eric Cartman, is going to introduce today's speaker, Lisa Fithian. Eric?
Thank you, Bonnie. We could not ask for a better guide today than today's speaker on the subject of civil disobedience and direct action in the service of social justice. Lisa Fithian has been at this work all her life, basically, since her student days in high school and at Skidmore College. She seems to have been involved in every one of the great causes of the last 4 decades in this country: environmental justice, student and worker rights, peace and global justice, immigration, housing. For her role in the Occupy Wall Street movement as a trainer and coordinator in direct action for justice, she came to be known as Professor Occupy. And she's been involved, again, in many more of the causes you're familiar with: justice for janitors, Black Lives Matter, fighting corporate trade and investment deals that injure workers and consumers and that harm the environment. She reminds me of that speech toward the end of John Steinbeck's The Grapes of Wrath, where Tom Joad talks about fighting for justice and said, "Wherever there's a fight, I'll be there." And many of us have been moved by that sentiment, but Lisa Fithian has lived it. She's also reflected on it very deeply, as you'll find out if you take a look at her website, organizingforpower.org. We have the benefit of hearing from her directly about this philosophy of direct, nonviolent social disobedience as a means to achieve social change. And she will help us apply this thinking to our own interest in the sanctuary movement right now for immigrants and asylum seekers. So please join me in welcoming our speaker today, Lisa Fithian. Thank you.
Thank you. Yeah. Good morning, everyone. It's really an honor and a pleasure to be here because this church in this space on this land is a really essential part of our community and the community of creating alternative relations and resistance. As Eric said, I have had a long history in this work. When I was in high school, I learned that there was injustice, and I also learned that people working together can change the world. And it's actually been my life service ever since, and I'm so happy to have done that. In this work, we've, just a little bit more about my history, because the sanctuary movement actually factors in really closely to who I am in my work as well. And I know that that's one of the reasons why I've been invited here today, because your church is taking a stand for justice and engaging in this long tradition of sanctuary. After high school and college, where I organized, I met Abby Hoffman. I ended up on the St. Lawrence River, and we fought a major battle. But it was during that time that there was U.S. involvement increasing in Central America, and we looked like there would be a war. And it was the faith-based community, through Fellowship of Reconciliation, Sojourners, many others, that began to form a network called Witness for Peace. And it was Witness for Peace that also then began to build a network called the Pledge of Resistance. And in the 1980s, we had hundreds of thousands of people across this country who committed to take nonviolent direct action and or civil disobedience to prevent a U.S. invasion of Nicaragua or all of Central America. Part of that movement was blocking federal buildings, going to jail, blocking recruiting stations, but it was also providing sanctuary. And churches across the country began a network of helping Central American refugees move to safety. And, we'll look at a slideshow in a little bit just about how important that tradition, because that Underground Railroad goes way back to the early days of this country for the abolition of slavery. So if you want to talk about civil disobedience, it's one of the things I've talked about to my hosts here. It's really something you do more than talk about. And if you're thinking about engaging in it, it's going to be really important that we follow up again to train. Because this work is, let me just say that this is sacred work. And when we look back at history, there are many who have come before us and who have risked their lives. and many who have lost their lives. And so I always like to take a moment whenever we do this work to just try and remember those who came before and to take a moment of silence for those we have lost in this struggle. So just a quick moment. There are many heroes whose shoulders we stand on, whether it was Mahatma Gandhi, Dr. Martin Luther King, the two that are most visible. But there have been thousands of more who've engaged in this struggle. And when you think about struggle and nonviolence in the traditions of Gandhi and Dr. Martin Luther King, there's like a lot of terminology out there that's some ways interchangeable, but I just wanted to sort of lay out a few terms and concepts. The first is, what is nonviolence, right? We say nonviolence a lot, but what is nonviolence? And really nonviolence is, for many, a way of life. It's a philosophy, and it's really rooted in this idea that we will do no harm, to any living creature. Direct action is another term that we see a lot. What is direct action or nonviolent direct action? Direct action really is about I think of it as willing to put your bodies on the wheels of the machine, willing to stop something in a very direct way at a point of conflict, where you're willing to say to power, no. You might not be willing to go to jail. Nonviolent resistance is a much broader concept or term, where we're really talking about how do we build movements and a way of life for struggle that's sort of in all of our work. And finally, civil disobedience is when we really are willing to take action to disrupt what we consider an unjust law, is really the tradition of it. But over time, as it evolved, the practice, it's also being willing to put yourself in a place of disruption, of getting attention. And one of the pieces that I've learned over the years, which is not a piece that people are particularly comfortable with, is that it actually requires people willing to work collectively to create a crisis for the people that are wreaking harm on our communities. And so we'll talk more about what does that really mean. So any conversation about civil disobedience, nonviolent resistance, direct action, would be remiss if we did not explore some concepts of power. Because at the end of the day, this is all about the dynamics of power. So what is power? If you look at up at the definition in the dictionary, it's nothing more than the ability to act. And so power is just about engaging agency. But when we think about who has power in this country, who do we often think about? Generally when I ask people pretty quickly go to the people with money, the rich people, the corporations. And you know what? We do think of them as having a lot of power because they do have power. We then often think about elected officials, people that we represent we entrust to develop laws. And so when I think about elected officials, I use the term the state, the whole structures of the government, the media, religion. I put them all together because they're interrelated. But what we don't often think about in terms of who has power is people, because that's not really what we're taught about. We're not really taught about power in this country. And I often say that people, yes, we do have power. Everybody's chanting, power, we got the power, we got the power. But I really believe that we have much more potential power than real power. Right? We have the potential to change the world, but we often don't realize it. So in this country, when we think about what prevents people from exercising that, like why don't we be fully in our power to change the world? Because that's the other thing. When we approach a conflict on social justice, we might try and fix housing, or we're going to try and do this, or we're going to follow the environment. But we don't often think that what we're really doing is building a base of power that will allow us to have the conditions that we want in our life. And so when we think about why we don't have the power, we could quickly brainstorm, and we don't have power because the system divides us. The government gives us misinformation. We have media that distorts the truth. We have drugs on our streets. We have shopping malls instead of town halls. Right? We have television instead of interaction. We now have social media. We have poverty. We have pay loans or pawn shops. When you begin to look at it, the education system is really a pipeline to prisons. When you really begin to look at every system in which we live in, it's designed to keep us from accessing our power. And that's why when the young folks of Ferguson rose up when Michael Brown was killed, one of their chants was the whole damn system, the whole darn system is guilty as... Because the truth is, from the very inception of this system, it has been rigged to serve some people and not all people. And it continues after hundreds of years. And why is that? Why does this continue? Quite simply because we let it. We go along. We're willing to let this happen. And why are we willing to let this happen? Bottom line, why do we cooperate? Because we are afraid of what will happen if we don't. And the systems of power in our country are very skillful at communicating to us what could happen if we step out of line. What could happen if we refuse to pay our income tax because we don't want to support war? What will happen if we provide sanctuary to someone who needs protection? There are consequences for these things. And if we know our history, we know that those consequences can include losing your life. If you look at the Black Panther movement, the indigenous movement, right? The leadership of all of these movements of color were pretty much assassinated or in prison, and many of them are still in prison today. So when you take on these systems of power, right, there will be consequences. So our job as organizers and part of the power of nonviolent direct action and civil disobedience is our willingness to non-cooperate. If the system maintains its power through our cooperation, we build our power through non-cooperation. Our willingness to stand up and say, no, we are not going to go along. And if we're going to do that, though, we have a serious work to do to make sure that we're prepared. Because if we just go out there and do that and we get whacked, we lose our base of people, right? And what we're really doing is we're building a network of people that are willing to stand together and take action together to improve our lives and to the lives of others. So as organizers, or people that are prepared to take on social justice, we have an obligation to make sure that when we're involved in any effort that is contesting power, that we need to make sure that all of us understand what the various options that we have, the choices we can make, and what the consequences of those are. And then the trick to this is to make sure that everybody makes their own decision. You know, if any of you are organizers, you know, or people that have organized events or moving people, we often tend to feel responsible for what people do or what happens, or, if I lead them into protest. But really, the nature of all of this work is making sure we all are standing in our own power. And so, in a quite simple way, exercising our power is about the choices that we make. And every choice that we make to take action, on my belief, either liberates or oppresses. You know, for an example, if I shop at Walmart, I need to understand I'm supporting a system for very low wages and disrespect. If I drink Coca-Cola, I need to know that they have killed labor leaders in Colombia, right? So it's about understanding more than just that moment thing, but what are the implications further out for what we're doing, and what does it mean for the world that we live in? So we get our power by making choices and being willing to take risks, and supporting people in that process. I want to talk just a little bit more about the kinds of power, because there's 4 kinds of power that we like to talk about. There's what's power over. And power over is really the power that is exercised by our dominant culture. It's a power of oppression, and it's a power of superiority. It's a power that was set in place when this country was founded, when the very first act of the Congress was to establish that only white people could be citizens. And then we saw hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of laws over generations that continued to instill that it was only white people that would benefit from the system. And what power over has become is the power of superiority, which is a form of internalized racial oppression, the belief that we are better, more gifted, entitled. That's power over, and it's legal power, it's historical power. Then we talk about power with, and that's the sort of power I've committed my life to. Some call it horizontal power, some call it shared power, some call it collective, but it's about recognition that we are all human, we are all equal, and that we all have gifts to bring to this work, and that we cannot change it without every one of us, that we all have a role, and it will be different based on our gifts, talents, but we are all needed in this work. The third kind of power I like to talk about is power within. Every single one of us has the power to change the world. And if you look back in history, there are those individuals, whether it was the man in Tiananmen Square in China who stood in front of the tank, whether it was the woman in Cairo, Egypt, who put out a call for January 26 that led to the overthrow of Mubarak. I mean, who would have imagined, 40 years, and then in a year or two, an entire thing changes. Every single one of us can change the world. And I often like to say to the younger folks, don't let them ever believe that you can't. Because it's so hard coming up in this world. A lot of us have seen a lot, but for the new ones coming up, it's getting more and more challenging, I think. Maybe that's not really true. Well, let me talk about the last power that I think is important to understand, and that's the power under. And that's where we sort of give up our power, where we're taught again and again and again that we won't be successful, we can't succeed, it doesn't matter. And we tend to live, that's where we're taught to live. And often I'd like to tell a little story once where I got a bunch of people arrested one night. It was 2 o'clock in the morning. I was waiting for them to get out of jail. I had to go to the bathroom. I went to the 7-Eleven. I said, can I use the bathroom? He said, I'm sorry, ma'am, you can't. It's a public restroom. I'm like, I didn't ask if it was a public restroom, whatever. I'm like, can't I just use the bathroom? It's like, you say I can't, but really it's that you won't let me because you're afraid of what your boss will say because it's against the rules. And he says, you're absolutely right. Sure, you can use the bathroom. So we say can't all the time because we're not willing to assume the responsibility of what it means to sit around won't, right? I don't know if I got that clear enough, but let me just say, if you think about your life, every time you say can't, really think about, is it that you cannot do this or that you're not willing to do it? So these types of power, and that power under also patterns to this concept of inferiority. And so in a race-based culture that we live in, right, with the dominant culture superiority for white people, in any system that we live in, there's a hierarchy of oppression, and you will always find African Americans and Native Americans at the bottom. And even in that stack of power, power over, power with, power within, and power under, it replaces that hierarchy. So our goal is to try and move towards those center places. So I believe that any process of change requires two fundamental strategies. One is about dismantling those structures and processes of oppression, and the other is about creating structures and processes of liberation. And I believe that this congregation and many people in Austin are in a process of trying to make change. So there's a way in which a lot of what you're doing with the sanctuary effort is challenging that current order that says human beings are illegal and that human beings don't have a right to, choose where they live. I think you're also building those structures of liberation in that through your actions to provide sanctuary, you're lifting up humanity. And you're willing to take some risks to ensure that the people's lives who need the support are honored and respected. To do this work, though, I think particularly because most of us come from that dominant culture, we have to often just take time to reflect on what it is that we're actually doing. Because it's very easy for us to believe that we can go help somebody, that we can engage in an act of, some might call it charity. But that mindset of charity is in fact replicating the same systems of oppression and division and superiority. And so really, I think what we're striving for is, what does solidarity mean? How are we taking action from a place of solidarity, where we understand that our lives are intricately, and our liberation is intricately connected to the liberation of other people? And that, again, we can't do it alone. So I say that because if we approach this work to think that we're helping this one person out, that's noble, but is it effective at changing the causes of this situation? And is it effective in helping each and every one of us to begin to have a different relationship with power and these patterns? Because we are patterned to see things in a certain way, and until we're able to sort of deconstruct that and learn to look with a different lens, a lens about horizontal power, an anti-racist lens, right, we can perpetuate harm. So it's really kind of an invitation for us to always think about what it is that we're doing and how are we exercising our power. So I think what I'd like to do is show some pictures, because part of my goal today is to ignite your imagination of what is possible, to help you sort of think more critically about the work that we do, and hopefully to give you some ideas and options on how to move ahead. And let me just say that before I start that slideshow, let me just talk a little bit more about sort of some key elements of what I think it takes, and I think some of this will come through in the slideshow as well. But if we are going to engage in social change work to challenge an injustice and build a stronger, healthier, more vibrant, alive community, I think one of the things that I've learned is that building a network of people is essential. A lot of my training that I've received around anti-racism work has come from the People's Institute for Survival and Beyond out of New Orleans. And your church is familiar with them because we've done a number of trainings in this church and a number of people have participated. But they talk about building a net that works. And so that may mean different things to different communities, but what I know for me in nonviolent direct action is that we need people organized in small groups who can work together and then network to other small groups. So let me just play out a scenario for one moment here. Let's say, hypothetically, this was a church providing sanctuary to a Central American family. And INS has identified this, and there's a fear, and we've heard that they're going to come raid this church. They're going to break into this church and raid this church, all right, to take that family out and deport them. So if we are serious about this, we actually have to be prepared to defend this church and to not let them pass. And so then what does that mean? How does that happen? What does that look like? How many doors are there here, right? How many points of access? So if you want to make sure they can't get in, you need to make sure there's a group at every single door that greets them and lets them know why they are not welcome here and why they shall not pass. To do that, you need to have your people organized in small groups. And you're going to need people inside as well. And you're going to need a media team over there. And you're going to need a legal team over here. And so if we organize in a traditional sense where one person is sort of telling everybody what to do in that sort of hierarchical model, right, one person can't hold it all. And then all of you are waiting to be told what to do. And our goal here is to build a world where we can collectively be making decisions about what's immediately going to happen where we are. So if you're at that door, and that's the one the police have chosen to come in, whatever group is at that door is going to be able to decide collectively about how they're going to choose to engage that. And they're going to be able to make that decision because you will already have had meetings and agreements. So that's another piece of this work. Because when we come to do this work, we are all going to have different ideas, different life experiences, different levels of risk that we're going to be willing to take. And so we need to actually have agreements around our commitment to nonviolence, around our commitment to maybe no property destruction. I mean, it's what your community decides is best for you, but there are historical questions in nonviolent civil disobedience and resistance that come up generation after generation. And that question of violence and nonviolence always comes up. And my perspective on that question is that I was raised in this culture. It is a violent culture. I have violence imbued through me. I can't not help it. And I also know that there is a war being waged on us. On the people of this planet, there's a war being waged. So when a war is being waged, we have some choices. We can choose to engage that war or not. And then if we choose to engage it, how do we engage it? And often it's nonviolence or violence. We know, having seen recent studies, that nonviolent resistance has been more effective at social change in revolutionary moments than violence has been. But you know, when somebody comes to do you physical harm, you know, unless you've really prepared yourself, there's a possibility you might try and defend or fight back. Like I often work with labor unions a lot, and the auto workers and the scabs, and I'm like, okay, you're on a picket line. What are you going to do if a scab comes and tries to go, guys, I'm going to clock him? I'm like, all right, you cannot be on that picket line. You need to be at the back, because as soon as we engage in violence, we've lost. We've lost not only because the media will criminalize us, but we've lost because that is not who we are, and that is not the world we want to live in. So one of the things, so we need to build a network. We need to have clear agreements. We need to make sure that we have a multifaceted strategy, because, again, there's no one thing that's going to win. The forces of oppression are so great. We need to make sure that we're, you know, using every different strategy, from creative visuals to prayer, to legislative stuff, but willing at the end of the day to stand in our power and to say no when that time comes. And that's why the trainings are so essential, because again, we're trained in all the wrong ways. And so when we begin to look at this stuff, we need to not only train our minds, we need to train our hearts, we need to train our whole spirit, our whole senses, because when we take this work on, as I said at the beginning, it is sacred. And when we take this action, we need to call on all the resources to help us, right? All the energies that are available out there in this world. And, you know, I talked about strategy. You need to have, like, if you really want to change the situation of which creates sanctuary, then you also need to potentially think about what is our plan? Why does this problem exist? Where can we make a difference here in Austin? Who else is already organizing on this? Who can we ally with? And make a plan with some clear goals and a campaign, right, that's about escalating action. And because that's part of this. None of these things, civil disobedience is one of your last tactics. So, you know, there's like 4 phases when you're trying to take on a campaign. One of them is preparation. You need to know, you know, who's got the power, what kind of power, you know, how to engage them. And then you need to, you know, do that. But then you need to do your research, and then you need to be able to go to them, to negotiate and say to the INS, we know that this may be the thing, but we don't believe in that, and we really want you to make a policy where you're not going to do that. And maybe the INS will do it, maybe they won't. Right? And then you educate more people. You're building more of a base. Right? How many other people in Austin know what you're doing here? How many of them have been asked to get involved? Right? Because the more people you have, the better. And this is an ongoing process, because after you educate, you want to go back to the INS. Maybe now you've got 500 people or like 30 congregations with you, and you're urging them, or maybe the mayor is your target, and you're saying to the mayor, we want X, Y, and Z. I don't know, because I haven't done the power mapping, but just saying. You go back and negotiate again. They again say no. Then you start demonstrating, escalating the pressure. Right? You continue to negotiate. They say no again. Now, we need to be clear why this is so important. Because if they said yes and fixed the problem, we're done. But as they continue to say no, they are exposing themselves as to that they are bad actors on the situation. Right? So you demonstrate. Then you might move to direct action, right, where you're now occupying a space or sitting down. And then if you still can't get them to move, you're sort of at a place where you have an ongoing struggle. But part of during that ongoing struggle might be to think about, are there parallel institutions, right? So maybe there's the ICE, right? So maybe now we're creating a community force that's working to make sure that police can't come into immigrant communities, right? We're going to build a parallel organization to have an opposite role than ICE has to make sure that, you know, whatever. I'm making things up, but the bottom line is this. I think the important point here is that when you're trying to change your larger system, we have to have multiple strategies and have to be increasing pressure. And quite frankly, my belief and what I've learned is that you have to actually be willing to say to them, you are no longer welcome in our community. You're no longer welcome to hold this office. You're no longer welcome to have this store, because you are not working within what is acceptable to our community. And so you have to be willing to put them out of business or have them go away, because that's just what's needed at times. I know it's not always making us comfortable. So let me just go back to this last thing, and I want to just show you some images. So I wanted to just, you know, root us in the fact that there is a long, deep history of this country around nonviolent resistance and direct action. You know, back to the abolition movement, as we spoke about earlier, the Underground Railroad, sort of a different form of sanctuary movement, to the women's suffragette movement, where many women went to jail to earn the right to vote. The labor movement, the occupations of the auto plants, you know, for 40 days that we refused to lose, strikes left and right, you know. Did you know that in the I think it was in 3 years, like 1930 to 1933, over 5 million workers were organized into labor movements, you know, which is an incredible amount. We've seen an enormous decimation of labor movements, and while labor movements or labor unions are not the solution to everything, they are a means of redistributing wealth, and they're an important part of worker protections, where I've done a lot of my work, and some of these images will come up, but you know, it's thanks to the labor movement that a lot of the conditions we have today, from an 8-hour day and overtime, exist. And so, again, if you want examples of the power of the people, there's many in our history. The civil rights movement is another movement, willing to sit down on the lunch counters, take over the buses, boycott, walk over bridges, and again, people risking their lives in this process, risking their bodies. Fast forwarding, I had many slideshows. You get what this one is. One day I'll get them all mixed. But I wanted to say that, through the 80s, through the 60s of the anti-war movement, there was tremendous stuff from occupations of Peace Park to many liberation struggles from the Black Panthers and the Chicano movement, who were doing a lot of creative nonviolent direct action from the free meal programs, education, libraries. Many revolutionary movements understand that change only happens when there's service and relationship with those who have the least. So you come fast forward into the 80s, you had the AIDS movement, Silence Equals Death, taking action, shutting down the FDAA, shutting down Wall Street, and finally winning drugs that have saved thousands and thousands of people's lives. That would not have happened without this kind of action and pressure. There's some great documentaries out about it. This is the anti-nuclear movement, where, again, thousands of people shutting down the plants in New Hampshire, Clamshell Alliance, and until more recently, actually, I think it's still the same. Since the 70s, there's never been another nuclear power plant built in this country. The Obama administration actually is funding nuclear energy more than any, but we've actually been, in this generation, been fighting back on some of that as well. This is the Central America movement. Again, people signing a pledge saying, I'm willing to go to jail if the U.S. is going to invade. And you know what? The United States never did invade Nicaragua. There's many other things that happened that weren't great, but there was never an invasion, and it looked close. This is some of the work, fast forward to some of the work I've done with janitors, because, again, learning from different movements and integrating, Justice for Janitors are a group of people who have made so little over the years. And so we began to do these weeks of actions, strategic weeks of actions, where we would be getting arrested every day and culminating, this is where we shut down a bridge by setting up a classroom on it. And I like to sort of call dilemma actions. And so that's another thing when you set up these, because that's the thing, if you're going to engage in resistance or direct action, you have to set it up, right, so that you get the outcome that you want. And you have to understand that part of the setup is having the police do the job for you. Like, you just have to do a little creative thing, and they'll shut the rest of it down, right? And so there's a way to work because, another piece of my work you'll see is, like, I believe that a picture tells the story. So if I'm going to do an action, or if you're going to defend the church, you want to have very clear signs or images of what this is about, so that one photo by the media will tell your story. And so this was an example. I've done so many things, like shutting up classroom, building homes. This is janitors in Denver, using puppets, visual space, always looking for that judo where they do something, how do you bend it back? In janitor land, in union land, you have to fight with your contractor legally. But really it's the property owners, the tenants, and the owners that have the real power. And so we would do lots of creative things. This building had an art exhibit, so the janitors did an art exhibit and brought janitor art. Right? It's always finding ways to just sort of flip it a little bit. Banners, visuals, gags, taking over people's events, bringing our message. This was a protest in Los Angeles where the county healthcare workers were trying to get a raise, and so we set up an occupation outside the county courthouse or whatever it was, county building. And there was a plan to get arrested, and it was we set up all kinds of visual stuff. I put a clothesline where people could write messages. I think whenever you do this work, you want it alive, creative, visual, colorful, because the culture that we live in is a culture of death, I just got to say. And the culture that we're trying to build is a culture of life. So when we do our work, we need to just infuse it with life and color. And it just this, I can't tell you how it changes us. And in this action, it was the clients of the home care workers that were willing to take risks. So they set up in an intersection. They were locked down to their wheelchairs and locked down to beds. So we set up a living room, basically in the middle of this intersection. And then the police just were not arresting us. We brought tents over, and then we put out blankets in the intersection and invited everyone for lunch, and the police could no longer tolerate it. So they started arresting people. And, you have this woman who is, arrested on behalf of the worker, right? So there are many different creative ways to engage, and a lot of my work is about how do you create the social disruption that's needed for policymakers, elected officials to come in and basically say we cannot have this happen anymore. We cannot have this happen in our community more, and that they bring the parties to the table to really have some kind of resolution. Because, we're doing this to make change, and we want resolution. We don't want to be fighting. We don't want to be struggling. We don't really want to go to jail. But when we do, we can become so much more powerful human beings. I mean, I've been to jail many, 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 many times, and I've probably gotten tens of thousands of people in jail over the years. And I particularly like to encourage white people to go to jail, because I think that it's white people, when you go to jail, you begin to have a sense of what it means to lose your privilege. And once you begin to have a sense of what it is to lose your privilege, then you can maybe have some sense of empathy for what it's like for black and brown people in our country that have no privilege, right, and have to deal with the abusive forces on a daily basis. And so beginning to have that kind of embodied experience, I think, is an important part of breaking down those structures of power over that we all carry because we were taught to, and beginning to build those other structures and relationships that are around lifting all boats. So I like to use vans. I like to use props when I shut things down. This was an action where we said the head of this corporation and the governor were in jail. So we put a bed on the middle of the trolley tracks and put them in bed together and got arrested there. But I think it's important because civil disobedience is civil. And again, our goal is not only to change the conditions and to build a stronger base of people, but it's also to bring people in and to win those hearts and minds. Because at the end of the day, if enough people are willing to say, no mas, no more, I'm not willing to take this, we're not going along, right, you can change the world. I mean, look at the Occupy movement, right? In a short span of a year, the entire national narrative was changed, and we have a new vocabulary from the 99% to the 1%. Look at the Black Lives Matter movement, right? There has been they have done more in this past year or two to force the debate and changes in policy at state, local, and federal levels, and are having victory after victory. But policy changes are never enough, because policy changes, yes, can begin to build a different culture, but as long as they're rooted in the same systems of oppression, right, we may be able to achieve some equity here and there, but we're not fundamentally repatterning our lives to be rooted in humanity, right? The humanity of everybody. There's an important organization in Texas called the Center for the Elimination of Disproportionality and Disparity. It's the only state in the nation that funds an organization to look at this work. And what they have done over the years is to show that you actually can change the outcomes by changing the ways that we think about the world. And that's one reason a lot of my work has been around undoing racism, because when we begin to think differently about the situation that we're in, we can begin to act differently, right? And we can actually change what those outcomes are. So let me just keep going, see if there's anything else here. And where am I on time? Are we almost done? 15 minutes. So I'm going to just wrap this up. You can see the final images. World Trade Organization, shut things down, change the world. So, yeah, I think that's sufficient for this, because we want to open it up for questions and comments.
Thank you, Bonnie, and thank you for what a terrific presentation. So talk a little more to us, won't you, about fundamental change, how we not only change the pattern, but how we reweave the fabric so we can have different outcomes and a different way of living, changing these things that keep making things happen the same way.
Mm-hmm. Well, as I said, I think there's two strategies. One is about deconstructing stuff. So beginning to develop our own conscious awareness about our own actions and behaviors, as well as being able to look at what's happening in our community. So there's that. It's doing the hard strategic work of organizing about what the problem is and how you change it, and it's about doing the internal work as well, which comes from training and self-education and working with other people. And it's really in those, it's in the interaction of diverse groups of people working together toward positive common good where new patterns can emerge. There's actually a thing called the science of complexity that's out there now that I've recently become familiar with. But it's actually the science that really talks about how this works, why it works the way it does. And really that science is that it is the edge of chaos where real change happens. And so it's, again, our willingness to sometimes be able to take the risks to go to a place of unknown, and to know that our community is holding us in those risks. And when you have a community and you're taking action in creative human ways, there's a juice of life to that once it's in your blood, there's no turning back, really. And it's in that work. So whether it's strategic organizing, nonviolent direct action, whether it's anti-racism work, whether it's the science of, right, whether it's permaculture, all of these things are very similar and are part of, building those new relations. I could break it down to another simple level, too. When men learn that their role is to make room and elevate women, right? When white people learn to, our role is to make room and elevate, in the sense of space, communities of color. When rich people learn, when straight people learn, right? Because until we learn sort of the ways that we can be oppressive, right, and undo that, we'll just continue to perpetuate it. So it takes an enormous amount of personal work to do this, and also to accept that personal work is not enough either. You need to do system work, too.
My name is David Patterson, and my thinking has evolved. I'm really glad you're here because I've had this idea. This is the first time I've voiced it in public. I think I can do it in 3 sentences. The insane drug policy of the United States kills maybe more or less 90,000 people a year in Mexico alone. Mm-hmm. And it appears to be that this is genocide in action perpetrated by the United States. Second thing is, we're having to pee at the most trivial of circumstance anymore. And it's gotten out of hand, or is getting out of hand. It's part of this genocidal policy. So the third thing is, and this is a very crude thing for a website that demonstrates me, no P, for you.org. And the only exception is if I pilot a passenger aircraft, a passenger train, a cruise ship. This is the rendering. I put my name at the bottom, and I'm wondering, you think this might have possibility?
Well, let me just say that I tend to agree with your analysis that the war on drugs was really a war on people, and it was a war on black and brown people, and it was exercised in this country through things like the 3 strikes you're out, and it has driven mass incarceration, and it has played out in Mexico and other places around the world, Colombia, through fumigations, destruction of people's environment, again, really for the purpose of taking other people's lands to extract the resources from those lands. And there is a long history of that in the United States. I mean, it's interesting, Bernie Sanders, I haven't watched a lot of the presidential debates, but on the most recent, on one of them, it was like, he gave a whole history of U.S. sort of like covert operations around the world. And recognizing that we have to understand this history. We need, until we understand the history, we're never going to be able to really change it. So, and I think that, on many different issues like the website, whatever, what I can say is that people taking action is great. Taking action only by yourself, you can change the world, but you need to build more people into it because, one person they can take out and then we're done.
Thank you. I'm interested in the challenge that is occasionally posed to folks who are interested in this work from people on the other side of some of the debates that we're involved in. Say, for example, the argument over same-sex marriage. Some of these folks use some of the same language and talk as if they're using the same techniques of nonviolent resistance and civil disobedience. And I wanted to get your take on how you respond to the attempt to say that what they're talking about is no different from what you're talking about.
Well, what I've learned over the years is that the conservative forces in this country have always learned from the progressive forces of the resistance. So, throughout history you can see that there's a patterning. And that's because sort of organizing is organizing and nonviolent resistance is nonviolent resistance. The question is sort of to what ends are we using it, which is why I've talked a lot about why we need to understand power. And I think if you go to some of the more conservative forces and argument or groups that are using our language and are using our tactics, you'll find that their methodology is really a much more top-down leadership model with people as cannon fodder, right? I mean, I have seen it happen in the anti-abortion movement. I've seen it happen around the Tea Party movement. I've seen it happen around the Black Lives Matter movement, where you have conservative forces organizing and engaging in tactics that are oppressive and harmful. So, I mean, one of the things I've learned over the years is that we need to learn from everybody, but we need to put our energy in our work, right? Instead of like trying to stop them all the time, how do we out-organize them? How do we build a greater base of power? Because I believe there are more people in our country that actually do care, but they don't know how, and they've been so oppressed, and their mind has been so constrained into the box, and have so many daily needs to take care of family and children, that we can't, there's a way in which it really just takes us to step just a little bit like this, and the world can be different. But it's risky, and there's consequences. But my life experience has told me is that it's well worth it. It's well worth it.
Lisa, first, thank you for a very interesting presentation. Cesar Chavez, the United Farm Workers, tried many of these nonviolent techniques you've talked about, and they didn't really gain traction until they started using boycotts. Could you comment on the interaction with boycotts and some of the techniques you've been talking about today?
Sure. I mean, a boycott is a form of direct action. It's a willingness not to buy that product. It's a willingness to put up a picket line. It's a willingness to tell people not to buy a product, right? But boycotts are different, are very difficult because it's a mass direct action strategy. It doesn't work with 2 or 3 people, but it can be very effective. I mean, that's part of how the South Africa won its independence. And it's what's happening in Palestine today, the boycott, divestment, sanctions movement. And the boycott movement is actually gaining traction. And there have been, in the past few weeks, there have been several corporations that are withdrawing their participation. GS4 Security Company, Hava Products. So boycotts are an essential form of direct action, but it's a mass direct action strategy that's hard to do. But it's a good one, and it can be effective. And the power of boycotts, really more than any other, is that it's economic strategy, right? And at the end of the day, economics in this country is what it's all about. So, Gene Sharp has a thing of 198 tactics, which I'll leave some. I have a couple copies to leave. And let me just say that back in the day, all these religious organizations were doing all these manuals on nonviolence, and we just have stopped doing that, and it's good because of paper. But there's a tremendous amount of resources online, and I can also share some links around. And I'm also going to leave you 2 copies of this Nonviolent Direct Action Manual, which was done when I was coming up in the 80s, and it's still totally solid today, as I believe. And so you can make copies or share them around as need be.
Okay.
I thought you were raising your hand. That's why I said that.
All right. Well, I have one.
Okay, and I've got others too.
What do you think, what are some strategies that you know about that may be effective in terms of organizing to identify and reduce excessive use of force by police or differential arrest by ethnicity, sexual orientation, etc.?
Great question. Because it's that use of force, the willingness of the state to use violence against its own people that is the greatest way that they keep us to cooperate.
And we have 10 minutes.
Yep. I'll make this quick.
You can make it 10 minutes if you want.
Oh. Okay. But I bet there were some other questions too. But so there are many different inroads, right? And I think the Black Lives Matter movement right now is laying some of those down. The training of police, the use of force policies, data collection, whether grand jurors are used. There's a variety of tactics that can be used there. In just the work of nonviolent direct action, right, we actually have to train people on how to deal with the potential violence we might face, okay? Because if you're sitting and blocking a door, you could be pepper sprayed, you could be kicked, you could be batoned, right? You could have your arm wrenched as they're arresting you, right? There can be violence against our bodies, and we need to prepare for that. And then the third thing, I think, in some ways, is the model of Witness for Peace. Witness for Peace were faith-based people who said, we are going to go down to Central America, and we're going to put our bodies between the army and the people. It's the same thing as the International Solidarity Movement in Palestine right now, or Christian peacemakers, I believe. It's a willingness to go and put your body between the guns and the people. And so that's why I said before, like, if there was a community of which police repression was particularly heavy, that sort of role might be useful or effective, but only if the community wants it, and only if there's enough relationships for that to happen, right? Because so that's part of it. Is like we can't go and do what we think is right based on what another community's needs are. There has to be a interrelationship there. And then if it's like, and that happens, actually the Black Lives Matter movement here I work with the White Caucus a lot, and there's an Allies for Black Lives Matter group that I know has met here. They've said to us at these protests, if you see some white folks coming in that look like they got nothing good for us, please block them from coming into our protests. So we can use our bodies. Our bodies are our most powerful tool to change the world. It's like we've only got one, and we've got to make the best of it.
And my concern is with the new laws that are being passed, specifically here in Texas, with the open carry and the nonviolent that we're taking. That's my biggest fear, is we go out to do this work, and there's been a major shift here, I think.
It's a great question. A lot of people say, is it worse in this country after 9/11, after the Patriot Act, after the Department of Homeland Security? And I think what I have come to believe is that every generation faces some level of violence, and for that generation, it's equally bad. You know what I mean? It's like people have been beaten up forever, they've been in prison forever, they've been shot forever, they've been, right? And so it's just different structure, different time. But that's the essence of this work, is that are we ready to take on those risks? And how do we organize to do that? That's why I say this is sacred work and spiritual work, because if you know that somebody's going to be carrying guns at your protest and you think there's a risk of being shot, well, one, you might not do that action. You might think of something else. Two, but ultimately what we talk about is building that web of restraint and support. So I would say in that kind of action, have as much media there, as much cameras there, as much, right, so that have enough security people on the edges, have your de-escalation team. So there's ways to organize to restrain violence, whether it's from people or the government or the police. So it's about doing the work and then knowing that you have a group of people that are watching your back and that are going to take care of you if something happens, and that you have your medical team. So we will not take risk unless we have built the container for us to do it well. Or maybe we shouldn't take those risks unless we've done that. Because we can do it, but there's consequences.
For those of us who sit out here on the privileged sidelines, if we have a passion about a particular issue, how do we make contact or identify the people or organizations where we can participate in some kind of a action?
I think that some of us are talking about, can't there be a broader community calendar here in Austin? Because there's so many groups. There's strong immigrant right organizing. There's strong environmental justice organizing. There's strong Black Lives Matter organizing. There's strong anti-racist organizing. There's strong housing. There's many different organizations. Even this church, a lot of stuff happens out of here. So I think that some of us, how do we get a more collective community calendar, a bigger network? Like, I really would like to see us build an emergency response network that works by text on our phones, because a lot of us may not do Facebook, but almost all of us have a cell phone. And there's ways to communicate and let people know where to turn up and turn out. There's maybe more I could answer about that, but Facebook is also the other place a lot of people are going these days. So
I'm just curious what your perspective is on what's going on in some of the political campaign rallies. Specifically, for example, the Trump rallies, where we're seeing an element of our population show up that is obviously prone to be violent. And what are the protesters at these rallies doing right and wrong?
I'm so proud of the protesters who are showing up at Donald Trump rallies and disrupting them. And I think that they have been becoming increasingly effective at what they're doing. Because you're seeing more and more sophisticated mobilizations that have actually, in some cases in Chicago, forced Donald Trump not to speak. And I think that's a good thing, because when he speaks, he ferments hatred, violence, greed, sexism. I mean, whether he would actually carry out all he says, it doesn't matter. Saying it sets the ground. And it is unacceptable. And it should be stopped. And he should be stopped, in my opinion. It's also exposing, though, that there is another constituent of our nation, our country, that has a very different view, right, and is willing to take action. Because I believe, actually, that justice would have, what's it saying? I do actually believe our country's moving in a better direction than a worse direction. And I think that's why we're seeing this extremism come out even more. Because I think at some level, it's like they're trying to like hang on to something. And at the base value, and I hate to say this, it's a lot of white men that are engaging in the violence against the protesters, although I did see that one clip of the African American. But what I don't know what happened there, but what I learned and heard is that one of the protesters was actually in a Klan suit. And if you look at that footage, it looked like one of them and then somebody in a Klan suit. And that might have gotten up his ire. I don't know. But it's like things are sometimes more complex than we realize. And so I think what's important is not for us to just accept the polarization, but to try and understand what other people's perspectives are, particularly if we have relationships with people that are supporting the more conservative views, and then trying to keep bringing them back into a more humane view of the world.
I'm strong in the environmental justice movement. When there was the Keystone Pipeline, the Texas leg,
Yep.
I was really upset about that. But I was not comfortable to go and protest or climb the trees or do any of that. But I thought, what I can do, I can send money for those that have gone to jail, for them to have money to get out of jail. So I thought, I can do my part that way. And then I marched in the parade in New York, the 400,000 plus.
People's Climate March.
The People's Climate March. But that was easy because I was with so many people. That makes a difference. Can you address that?
Let me just say that there's always more that we can do than we think and than we realize. And I just need to say grandmothers are one of the most powerful forces in the world. And women are some of the most powerful forces in the world. And black people are some of the most powerful forces in the world, as are Native people. And so we should never underestimate what we can do. And let me just say, I have seen many a grandmother go to jail, get carried out, So I'm not saying you should. The power of this work is you all have to decide what is the right place for you to be. And giving money is easy. And thanking people for their work is easy. But we need everybody. So everyone has to sort of think about how can I do more.
And I think we're going to have to quit there. Thank you so much, Lisa.